Hey folks, Steve here with another Fatal Alliances video. Want to say firstly, I know it's been a month since my last video, and it's kind of been a busy time for me lately with some changes at work and the holidays and everything else, and so it has been longer than I originally wanted to post some videos, but here I am. I tried recording this video here once before, and it went for an hour and 20 minutes, and it was okay. But I realized I had made some mistakes, and so hopefully this take of the whole video will work better for demonstrating what I'm going to do here. As a little bit of a sort of non-denominational winter gift-giving holiday gift to all of you viewers, I'm going to do what I've been meaning to do for a long time, which is actually start to play a game of Fatal Alliances solo, but on video, and then that way I can demonstrate to you, if you're a newbie, kind of how the game is played, use and explain mechanics as they come up in the actual game, and I'll probably still do separate videos to look specifically at different things. But I think what's really important with trying to learn the World in Flame systems and by extension Fatal Alliances, you need to see all of the parts working together, and then a lot of the little clicks will start happening in your mind about how to play the game, why are important decisions made, and everything else. So we're going to run through a game turn is my goal here, at least one game turn, but I'm likely only going to be able to do maybe the first impulse in this video. I don't want to keep, I don't want this video to go too long, and I want to keep it reasonable, so if you're going to sit down and watch it, you're not sitting there for a couple of hours, right? So it is going to take some time because I'm not only making all of the decisions and moving all the pieces on the board, I'm also going to be explaining these things, and so I'm going to be controlling every single power. I'll need to make a decision for every single power, and that's going to take a little bit of time to go through once all the powers are involved in the war. It's going to take some time. It will kind of go quicker over time because I won't need to explain every mechanic over again as I do it. But because it's going to involve all the major fronts eventually at some point, that may cause the game to run a little bit long. So if you're going to be following along in this video, I do recommend you go out to Board Game Geek and grab the latest version of the rules. Hopefully there'll be an even newer version of the rules at some point in the future, but the version out there today is pretty good. It's got a lot of good fixes from the original version, and I will be using all the rule changes and rule specific things from that version of the rules as we go through here. First thing I'm going to point out is that I'm going to be using the pre-configured startup setup save file that I put out there on Board Game Geek. So if you go to the Board Game Geek page for Fatal Alliances, in the file section there is a Vassal save that I have constructed for the game. That is more or less what you're going to see here in the Vassal module as I demonstrate today. There are going to be a couple of minor differences that exist. One being that in one of my previous videos covering setup, I miscounted some of the Commonwealth convoys, and there are actually 10 that I should have added that are not on the Board Game Geek version of this file, but it will be on here for my demonstration. 10 extra convoy points should be allotted to the Commonwealth. I just went ahead and put them in Scapa Flow with the other excess convoys. The convoys that I've set up on the map right now basically make it that all the resources are going to get to the UK that it really needs to operate, and all the rest of these are going to be excess, so as different ones get destroyed, we can replenish them right away. Everything else in here, I've done the setup per the setup charts, and again, if you're using my Vassal save, a lot of this work would be done for you. One other thing is that the political points start at 5 in the latest rules, not 10. So I had to move those for this, and that is not going to be set up correctly in my old save file. I'll try to get some update maybe published for that to include some of these changes. Uh, and so if you want to kind of, really what we should do is look at this as setting up the game. You can watch my previous 3-part series on setting up the game to be played. But just so you kind of look at the rules, it's section 22 of the rules, sort of in the back of the rule book that you have, or towards the bottom of the PDF if you're using the new rules. And it's basically asking you to kind of get things set up a certain way. So there's some units that are going to be set up, sort of over here to the side that they're not quite in the game yet. And obviously the setup charts that come with the game will point you to putting units everywhere and anywhere. So I took care of all of that. However, there are a couple of things to keep in mind that are part of setup that are worth talking about if you're about to start playing a game. So once you've set up all your units, just kind of know that I set up the convoys already, but technically what you're supposed to do is set up those convoys in port. And then, if you look at what are the last couple of paragraphs of section 22.1, or I'm sorry, 22.2 of the rules, it's going to talk about the need to, once you finish setting up, you make naval moves out to sea with your naval units. And you would treat this as a naval action, and if they're neutral major powers, they can only do these with convoys. Because I'm starting this video at the 1914 basic start of the war scenario, the only naval units that could be moved right now are convoy units. So I have just set up all the convoys where they need to be, but realistically, what I really supposedly did was set them up in ports, various ports around the world, and then move them out to sea where they could form these lines of convoys to transport everything. It basically means that you can't just set up the convoys anywhere on the map when you do set up. There has to be a little bit of logic to them, but it's more than likely that the power that you're using to set up the convoys for has ports everywhere that they kind of need to be. Like the Commonwealth, they've got ports in Africa, they've got ports in India, Malaysia, the whole thing. The other thing to look at now is 22.3, so just to talk specifically to what needs to be set up for the campaign. There's a couple of things in there to keep in mind, like what minors are aligned versus conquered, and that will kind of come into play later, so it might be good to reference back to this at some point. May even want to create some sort of chart or notes for yourself so you don't forget. One thing that we have to do before we get going here is I'm going to open up the world map. And on the world map, at least in the Vassal module here, is where all of the at start entry pool markers are. This controls and governs when the United States and the Commonwealth will come into the war. Obviously, the Commonwealth will come in much sooner than the U.S. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull 2 markers each and put them into the entry pools. So we'll go ahead and do that now. So this will be the 2 entry chits for the U.S. A 3 and a 3. Oof, strong start. So we'll put that there. And then the Commonwealth will get 4 and 3. Wow, really strong pulls. I believe the Commonwealth needs 18 entry points to enter the war, and they're already, maybe 40% or something, just off the top of my head. They've got a pretty good start on that, which is really strong. Even the U.S. has a pretty good start. So this is normally somewhat hidden information, but because I'm playing myself in a solo game, I will be more or less aware of where the entry pools are at any given time. But ordinarily, only the U.S. player or the Commonwealth player would truly know what the standing is here. Just kind of poking around at everything else, looking at the rest of the rules in 22.3, we're going to see that the Commonwealth has the initiative +2. The weather roll is a 5, so I'm not going to share the weather charts because I think that's on the player chart, and I don't think the game designers want that freely shared. I've scanned my own copy for my own purposes, but if we looked at the July-August column and a die roll of 5, everywhere has fine weather, all except for The northern monsoon zone, which is this sort of band right here, that is sort of a tropical zone, and that's going to cause some issues for any of these sort of Pacific activities, but there's really not going to be that many of them the first couple of impulses, so not much to worry about here. I think we're going to be good to go. Only other thing then to take a look at is there are a couple of rules that are going to map out what has to happen on the first couple of turns. So in the first impulse, Austria-Hungary is going to declare war on Serbia, who must align with Russia. No other declarations of war can be made, and then Austria-Hungary will take a land action. Everyone else will pass. Then on the second impulse, which would be the Allied impulse, Russia is going to declare war on Austria-Hungary. And then on the third impulse, Germany is going to declare war on Russia and France, and then potentially make any other declarations of war that they wish. And that's really going to get the whole war started. So I think we could look at, getting started now. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that technically at the very beginning of the game, you would only have the Austria unit set up down here, and you would not have the Serbian unit set up. Minor countries don't set up unless they have their unless they're declared war on or they're aligned in some fashion. And so I set these guys up as part of setup just to get them out of the way, because you have to set up the Serbians. I just take care of that right away. We're going to go through that process. We're going to go through the beginning steps of the turn, and we're going to run through this. But again, it's going to end up being Austria-Hungary will declare war on Serbia, and then basically Austria-Hungary is going to perform all of its actions for its impulse, and then that'll be the end of the impulse. If you take a look at the sequence of play, and I just sort of took a screenshot of the rules for this just so you can take a look at it. The turn is going to go reinforcement stage, lending resources stage, initiative stage, and then the action stage. And these first three go very quickly, and then the action stage is where the real meat of the game, followed up by the end of turn stage stuff. So the way it's going to work is there's going to be a weather roll ordinarily at the beginning, and then 2 impulses, and at the beginning of the third impulse you're going to do another weather check. And so the weather could potentially change even within a turn multiple times. I really like that. It adds a lot of good variance, and it's an interesting system. But for now, again, some of these things are going to be preset on this first turn. So if we take a look at then your rulebook, we're going to go and scroll all the way up and look at the reinforcement stage, which is technically section 4. So because this is the beginning of the turn, and it's turn 1, there really isn't anything to reinforce. How this would ordinarily work is the turn marker moves into the next production circle slice, and all the units that are here, or rather most of the units, if they're land, there's some rules about ships that we'll get to eventually, they will be able to be placed on the map. So we won't have any now, but next turn we would have these units, and they have to be placed in home countries, home country cities in particular, and you got to watch out for stacking limits. Austria-Hungary is kind of funny because they are represented as a multicultural empire that didn't really have a strong sense of national identity, and so their forces are divided between Austrian units, which you can see here are sort of the white counters with red, and Hungarian counters, which are the white counters with green. And they are treated a little bit differently, and they can't cooperate well. And when you're looking to reinforce these units, Hungarian units can come in Slovakia, Hungary, I think Transylvania might be the other place, and then Austrian units can only come in Trieste, Austria itself, and then I believe Bohemia. And so there are even places, so, Galicia, I'm not sure how to pronounce that properly, aren't actually reinforcement locations for Austria-Hungary, oddly enough, and I don't know if that's fully intentional or not. But basically, if you're playing Austria-Hungary, watch out because you have some constraints around where you can put your units. All of this is detailed in a special rules section I think section 15 of the rules, so just watch out for that. And it's why I've sort of logically set up that the Hungarians are playing defense around the Carpathians, and the Austrians are focusing on taking out Serbia because I'm not going to have any cooperation issues, and they're all set to go. Divisions and artillery do not have a nationality called out, so they can be involved in either or. I think same thing with aircraft here, so no biggie. So reinforcements, there are technically none, so nothing to do here. We would then move on to the lending stage of the turn. Because we're at the beginning and there's not much else to do, there's going to be existing trade agreements that are set up, and those are detailed in the rules. They're in section 5, which is right in the section that we're looking at in the rules off on another screen, or if you're following along. So we're not going to make any changes there either, so nothing to worry about. What's really great about Fatal Alliances in World in Flames is that the rules, for the most part, are set up in the sequence of play. So what's nice is as we run through this, you can follow along and just know that we're going to the next page of the rules, essentially, to look at the next stage of the turn. Next, if we were following the sequence of play, we would look at the initiative stage, but the initiative has already been decided for us. This first turn order is predetermined. The Central Powers are going first, obviously, invading Serbia. And then we begin the action stage. Again, the weather has been predetermined, so we're not going to do that now. One interesting thing about the weather is that, obviously, as you go through the seasons, the weather will actually be worse and worse and worse during the winter, obviously, and it will cause the turn to go faster, because what essentially is going to happen is, at the end of every impulse, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can read this better, there's a chance that the turn could end. The first couple of impulses are marked as NA here, and that means there's no way for the turn to end, but it's possible as more and more impulses take place that there are going to be a 1 in 10 chance, 2 in 10 chance, 3 in 10 chance of the turn ending, and the weather chart will actually specify how many squares the impulse marker is going to slide as you play. So if it's winter, you might have it that, or depending on the weather, which will be worse in winter, this thing could slide 2 boxes every impulse. So if it's first impulse 1, 2, next impulse 1, 2, next impulse 1, 2, it could be that the turn's going to end very quickly on impulse 7 or at the end of impulse 7 rather than the end of impulse 14 or something like that. But again, we've got fair weather, so it's going to be a fairly long turn once things get underway. Next, we are going to look at Section 9, which is the Declare War step, and this is going to be important. We're actually going to take some of these actions. So first of all, if we follow, there's a sort of a numbered list of things that you're going to do as part of this step as the active power. So number 1, and this is going to be again on Section 9 of the rules, we are going to break 1 or more of our neutrality pacts. Well, we're not going to do that. We don't need to do that. There are no neutrality pacts at the beginning of the game. Are we going to be declaring war on a major power? No, we are not going to be declaring war on a major power. Serbia is not a major power. Going down to 3, the U.S. is not attempting to join, so we skip past that. So we get to Section 4. Major powers announce which neutral minor countries they are declaring war on. This may cost political points. So ordinarily, declaring war on a minor might cost, I think it's like 3 political points. But because this is a mandatory one, as dictated by the game scenario, we don't actually pay the 3 political points. Later on, if Germany, to say, declares war on Belgium, we will pay that penalty, but for here, we will not. But because Austria-Hungary is declaring war on a minor country, there's going to be a role for U.S. entry action. And so I'm going to pull up the chart on my other monitor here that you won't see, but take a look at your player aid chart. There's going to be a column for U.S. entry actions. Now, if you're playing this game by yourself, it's kind of tough to keep track of everything for every country at all times. But if you're playing multiplayer and you're playing something where maybe you only control 1 or 2 powers, the U.S. player is going to want to make sure that they're looking at that chart, because they need to recognize and take action whenever one of these things happens in the game to increase the U.S.'s ability to enter the game. If you miss out or forget or just aren't paying attention and these things happen and you don't do the entry actions, that could have a pretty big effect on the game and delay the United States entering the game, which you don't, you're going to eventually want to have happen, right? So what we're doing is we're having a country declare war on a minor. So this, I believe, would be number 20 on the actions. Central powers declare war on a other minor. And this will actually be in effect for both the Commonwealth and the United States. So we'll do 2 separate rolls, and the die number is 5. So we're going to roll for the U.S. If the number rolled is 5 or less, the U.S. will get another entry chit, and they do. So I'm going to pop open our world map. I'm going to head over to this, and they're going to get a 2. Now we're going to do the same for the Commonwealth, and that roll failed. So the United States does not like the sound of Serbia being declared war on. The Commonwealth apparently just doesn't care that much. They're going to drink some tea and have a good time. Returning then to the rules, we are going to allocate control of minor countries declared war on this step. So as dictated by the rules, Russia will be aligning Serbia. But it's important to note that this does not actually mean that Austria-Hungary is at war with Russia yet. And it's important to call that out in a few moments as we get to the next couple of steps. So bear with me here for a second. Each major power may voluntarily align one minor country. This step, we don't need to do that. There's nothing to do here. We would roll a die for each voluntary alignment. Again, not going to happen. So now we get to step 9 of that section, and it's saying active major powers in minor countries may call out their reserves. So looking at the actual rule for that, which is 9.7, it's going to say that each major power and many minor countries have reserve units that can be called out provided they are at war with a major power. So right at this moment, as Austria-Hungary is declaring war on Serbia, Russia is not at war with them, and they are only at war with Serbia, which means they cannot call out their reserves yet. They will have to wait until they are officially at war with another power, which is going to start happening on the next impulse when Russia reacts. And so if I look at the force pool here, you have a reserve pool, and these units either have an M because they're militia units to be set up specifically in certain cities, or they're just reserve units and they can be set up pretty much anywhere. We can't call these out yet, so they are locked, but it's a nice way to get a bunch of, more or less free units that are going to pop up, the mobilization of reserve units to get them into the war. There is an option in the rules, in the latest version of the rules, that if you have units in your reserve pool during the morale step at the end of the turn, you actually get a bonus to your morale to offset other morale penalties that could happen. I am not going to be using any options for this demonstration, and so when the time comes, I'm going to bring out all of the reserves because it doesn't make any sense not to. But if I were playing with that option, I would need to think about, is it worth bringing out a lot of units? And at the beginning of your impulse, you can always decide if you're going to call out any. But again, in this particular case, I do not see the value, or rather, in this particular case, I do see the value in bringing out the reserves. I just cannot do that quite yet. So now we're done with the declare war step. We're going to go on to the actual choosing actions step. So again, the rules are going to dictate to us that the action taken here is going to be a land action. The options are typically pass, which is pretty self-explanatory, naval, which you're going to do a lot of naval stuff, air, which you're going to do a lot of air stuff, land with a lot of land stuff, and then combined. Combined action allows you to do a little bit of everything, but not a whole lot of everything, and can be sort of a wasted action if you just don't make use of your limits. If you look at your game charts, there's going to be a section talking about allowable activities, and you can see on there that if you say, oh, I'm going to take a land action, what does that allow me to do? Well, I can declare a bunch of war, I can do combat air patrols, I can do escorting of aircraft, I can intercept aircraft. Now, a lot of that is not going to take place yet because at this point in the war, the only air units that are really available are light land bomber units that are really mostly only good for observation. You can't actually do intercepting missions until you have fighters, and they don't come in until 1915, or maybe it's 1916. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there is a limit on the number of naval air missions we could do on a land action, but we probably won't do any anyway. There's also a limit to how many ground strikes we can actually perform and how many rail movements we can actually perform. So as Austria-Hungary, in each major nation, is going to have a slightly different set of limit numbers on things that we're limited by, would be able to perform 2 strategic bombardments, though we're not going to be doing any of that. We'd also mean we could do 2 ground strikes, which we will probably try to utilize. And we could do 2 rail moves, but we're probably not going to do any of that this impulse either. And then everything else is mostly around the land moves and land attacks, in which we have unlimited number of with this type of action. So for the most part, we're going to pretty much do everything that we want to be able to do for this. So if I look at, I just want to make sure I got everything here. Okay, so now that we have chosen our land action, we're going to start running through these actions in the order that they're in. It is important that you follow the order, because things like ground strike missions as compared to ground strike mission compared to land movement is really important. So the artillery units need to fire before you do any movement, which means if your artillery are not in range, they're not going to be able to get there, right? So you have to, if you're going to strike with artillery, they already have to be in place adjacent to an enemy to actually utilize. So that's going to be kind of important. Just looking at this list here, naval air missions. Well, I don't think I want to use any of our air missions for this, so I think I'm going to pass on that one. So no naval air missions. Is there any naval movement? No. And especially because if I look at our activity limits, I actually can't do a naval move on a land action. None. So I'm not going to be doing any naval movement. There's not going to be any naval combat. There's not going to be any opponent naval combat. And when it comes to strategic bombardment, we don't really have any units that are capable of doing strategic bombardment right now with Austria-Hungary, so we won't be doing that either. What we do want to look at then is the ground strike mission. And so if we look at the rules, just check my time, 30 minutes. If we check the rules, you're going to want to scroll down several pages past the naval stuff, which we will get to eventually, to 11.7. So, 11.7 is ground strikes, and this is going to allow either an air mission ground strike or a artillery ground strike against enemy units that are within range. If we're successful with a ground strike, it will flip a unit. When a unit is flipped, it basically provides a bonus to the enemy that's attacking it when it's flipped. And so our goal with artillery will always be to ground strike the units that are in range, cause them to be flipped, which are then followed up with normal ground combats that will potentially eliminate those units or force them to retreat and that sort of thing. So if we look at 11.7 in the rules, the ground strike area of the rules, it's going to talk about using bombers and artillery. Right away, I'm going to say I'm not going to use any of my air units to do a ground strike, mostly because the balloon here actually can't. You can see the numbers here on the stars. The four corners of air units are going to dictate their factors, whether it's air-to-sea factors, air-to-air factors, bombardment factors, or their tactical factors. The balloon here is only going to be used for observing, which is something you need to do in ground combat, land combat, or else you'll suffer a negative to your die roll. This is because in early World War I, airplanes were, air power in general was only really used for observation, not for things like tactical bombing and strategic bombing. Over time in the war, eventually the true fighter role started to become a thing, and the attempts to use tactical bombing or just rough bombing in general sort of evolved over the course of the war. But at the beginning here, not a lot of options. So we're just going to focus on the artillery. Now, because the Serbians set up well behind the line, the only unit that can actually fire artillery in range of an enemy is this Skoda 305 artillery unit. Now, so we are going to use this unit to try to artillery strike this hex with these units in it. Something to keep in mind is that when you declare war on a nation that you were not at war with, for that impulse, you have surprised them. Now, surprise is detailed in section 17 of the rules. For the most part, what it would have impacted us here in Serbia is that the river provides no defensive benefit, and artillery strikes actually get 2 dice per enemy unit that you're striking in the hex to attempt to flip them. So had I been a maybe more bold Serbian player, I might have set up my units further up around Belgrade, or at least put some units in Belgrade. Problem with doing that is, on the very first impulse, so that the war is declared, the the Austro-Hungarians would have been able to use their artillery to shell the crap out of the units, having a much greater likelihood of flipping them, and then in the coming attacks, they'd get to ignore the river, and you would likely have seen many Serbian units destroyed and Belgrade taken anyway. And so, as the Serbian player in my mind, or the Russian player in my mind is setting up these units, I wanted to put them in a more defensive position. And there's a special rule in the rule book for Serbia that in order for them to be conquered, not only do you need to take Belgrade, you also have to take Skopje, not sure how to say that properly. And with Skopje way back here in the mountains and away from the fighting, I can give up Belgrade. There are some consequences to losing Belgrade, unfortunately, but I really don't have much other choice at this point. I really need to try to make these Serbian units last as long as possible to tie up Austrian units as the allied player. So, Let's get our ground strike underway. So ordinarily, if we were to follow the step-by-step for ground strikes, if they were involving plane units, then the opponent would get to fly combat air patrol to potential target hexes. You designate now all our artillery and fly all the selected attacking bombers. So we're going to say it is this artillery, this top counter here of the stack. Then our opponent would get to fly intercepting fighters to the target hexes. Not going to occur here. And then we'd also in turn get to fly our own intercepting fighters to the target hexes. But again, not going to be relevant here because no airplanes are actually involved. There would be then fight between any of those air units that entered in the hex for air-to-air combat, and then the surviving bombers would get to attack their units because the artillery is just there and they're not going to become intercepted or anything like that. We're just going to get to do our rolls. So what we'll do then is, and it's important to point out that normal artillery have a range of 1, so it has to be here. I can't hit anybody else with these other artillery units. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll a d10, and we want the number to be the combat number in gray here on the artillery unit or lower. So 4 or lower on a d10, that's a 40% chance of success. If the target hex was forest or swamp or jungle, we'd actually have our factors here cut in half, but because it's mountain, while mountain is good defensive terrain for just normal combat, it doesn't actually provide any additional protections for a ground strike. So with our surprise artillery strike, we will roll for the second Serbian Corps, the bottom unit here. I'm going to roll 1 die at a time to see if it works. No. Alright, so that failed. Now we're going to roll for the third Serbian Corps. No. And yes! So, this paid off a little bit. The third Serbian Corps now becomes flipped. And this would provide a bonus in combat if we attacked here. Not sure that we're going to attack here this impulse, but this is good. This is good. We have now flipped a unit. And now that the strike is over, we are going to flip the attacking artillery. So it's complete. We'll go ahead and flip it. There we go. And so, you might say, well, you just flipped a unit to flip a unit. Did that really gain you anything? Well, it's going to depend, because you can use artillery units as long as they're face up and they weren't used to ground strike or anything. They can be involved in land combat, and they'll add their number to combat. So if this stack had just attacked, 4 for that corps, 4 for the other corps, that's 8. Then plus 3 for the artillery would be 11 combat factors. But now, down here, the combat factors for the stack are only 8 when attacking, if I were to attack this stack in the mountains now, because the artillery is flipped. So you kind of have to decide, is it worthwhile to use your artillery this way? In this case, at least for demonstrating purposes, sure, it was worth it. Now we would do rail movement. So all of our artillery strikes or ground strikes are done. We don't want to do any rail movement. I have no reason to do any rail movement at this point. So now we're going to do normal land movement. Something to keep note of is that your movement speed or factor for land units is the second number. And you can see that artillery, for the most part, are going to be pretty slow, either having a 1 or a 2 movement speed. This makes it so that, even if you're massing lots of artillery and you're using them to good effect, as your line moves forward, you're always going to be playing catch up with the artillery as they trail behind, and then you have to wait for them to be in place, and then fire again. Then they're flipped again, and then they're again following after your unit. So keep in mind that you want to get them in place for maximum effectiveness, and they're just slow as all heck. And you can imagine trying to move through the mountains is going to be a major problem for an artillery unit. So just keep that in mind. The way that movement's going to work is that each type of hex has a certain terrain cost in movement. The terrain chart is located on the world map, but I have a screenshot here just to use for comparison. So because most units in this game, period, because it's World War I, are going to be using leg movement, this is where we're going to really want to pay attention. A clear hex is 1 hex, or 1 movement point. Forest is 1. Jungle is apparently NA. Yeah, because there's none in Europe. Swamp is a pain in the butt. Mountains are a pain in the butt. Desert mountains also a pain in the butt. So if you move, a unit can always move at least 1 hex. But if the movement required to move into that hex is greater than their movement allowance, they're going to flip. Now, fortunately, we're still working with a lot of open ground, and so I'm going to want to move these Austrian units up in preparation for any land combats that we may want to execute this turn. So these guys aren't going to move anywhere. They're kind of well situated. I'm going to have these guys just move up 1. And rivers don't actually add anything to movement, so we just move them up. This unit, because I want to bring the artillery along, they're only going to move up 1 space. And note that I'm not going to be moving the balloon. The balloon has to stay there because we're doing land movement, not air rebasing, not air moving. So we will move those guys up. Similarly, we will move these guys. Let's see. I think what I'll do is just move these guys up 1 for now. I could move them up to here, but I'm not going to yet, and I'll explain why in a minute, and then these guys will also move up. The reason why I didn't want to move a unit up here yet is that even if I get in here and I could potentially attack, if the attack doesn't go well, then this hex is sort of a kill box for retaliation from the Serbians, who are going to attack from here and potentially here, and that's going to be a bad time for our Austrian units. I'm not ready to use them quite yet, so moving forward like this is okay. Important thing has just occurred, though. I've taken Belgrade. So a couple of things to do with Belgrade. One, Belgrade has a factory, but it is a blue factory. Blue factories, when you take them from the enemy, just means they don't get to use that factory. If this factory was a red factory, like the factories in Budapest, Bratislava, Vienna, that means you could use the factory if you took it from the enemy. And that's how you can sort of increase your production rate, is by taking red factories from the enemy. Here, we're merely depriving the Serbians, and by extension, the Russians, from getting a factory. We have also taken a capital, and so a minor capital that has been aligned to Russia will mean that at the end of the turn, during the morale phase, there will be a penalty to Russian morale. So what I'm going to do here is just turn 1, impulse 1, Belgrade minor capital -1 morale for Russia. Now, they are aligned to Russia. We're not at war with Russia, but by the time the morale phase comes at the end of the turn, this will count as a penalty to Russia's morale because the capital is occupied. Additionally, I'm going to save that note. Additionally, we have taken a red print city. Red print cities in this game are objective cities that matter on victory conditions, so obviously you want as many of them as you can, and they're usually either capitals or important production centers or cultural centers or whatever of a particular country. So we have taken it. If you look at the game chart, there is, and I'm not looking at the right one, there is a chart for politics and morale, and you could see that under the lose morale for, there's an enemy control of a minor country capital, so that's going to be 1. But if we look down at the politics section, there is line 3, if you take an objective city or port, then you get 4 political points. Now, there's a tag on there that says must be taken in combat. That's actually not 100% true. I got this confirmed on the Board Game Geek thread that I posted yesterday or earlier today. That it just means not through alignment. So as long as you're taking an enemy city, objective city, you're going to get 4 political points. The latest version of the rules also point out that if you take a resource or non-objective city or port from the enemy, you get 1 political point. So we've just gotten a little bit of a coup here in that we've gotten 4 political points. So I'm going to go out to the track, and I'm going to take the common central power political points, and I'm going to add 4 to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 9. So 9 political points. And now land movement is complete, I think. If I look out here, are there any other land movements I want to do? And the answer is not really, because I set up these units on purpose where they're at, in defensive terrain, here with a fort, as protected as they can reasonably be at this point. I'm not going to do any other sort of movement. So looking back then at the sequence of play, if we've done our land movement, then we would debark any land units at sea. We have none. Do any amphibious invasions. There are none. And now we have the question about land combat. So the thing with land combat, obviously, is that you're going to want to look at your combat factors and look at how many combat factors you can point at a target hex of the enemy. Now, if we want to look at the rules, just work our way through the rules. Is going to be 11.12 as land combat. We would need to declare where all the attacks are going to be before any of them actually occur. So essentially what we would need to do is figure out, okay, are we going to attack here? Right? We can't attack the Russians because we're not at war with the Russians yet. We're just at war with Serbia. So this hex has 4 combat strength. We'd be attacking it with a 9 combat strength. If you were to look at the combat chart that's in the back of the physical rulebook, 9 to 4 is 2 to 1 odds. We get a +4 to our die roll for combat. We'd get to ignore the river, which would ordinarily half our combat factors. And a +4, I'm trying to see if there are any other bonuses. It doesn't appear to be the case. Well, if we just did, if we looked at the combat table and said, look at average, right? You rolled 2d10. The average is going to give you something like 10, 11, 12. +4. Yeah, that looks okay, but it might not be enough. Not enough to do what we really want to be able to do. It's dicey. We could very well roll poorly, and we could actually lose our own units. And they would go poof, and all of a sudden now this way into Hungary is open. So we don't want to attack there, I don't think. Here, we have units set up in the mountain. Normal units, when they're in a mountain hex, have their combat factors doubled. Mountain units, mountaineer units, like this particular white print unit here you see here, the MTN, Serbian Corps, when they're in mountains, their combat factors are tripled. So this is actually, let's see, 3 times 3 is 9, plus 3 times 2 is 6, so 15 combat factors. Even if we added all of our guys together here, 9 plus 8, 17 to 15, that's 1 to 1 odds. Not necessarily very good. If I look here, it might be worth it. So Units that are flipped still defend at their full combat ability as long as they're in supply, which this unit is. So this is really 12, combat power 12. We could attack with 8, 9, 10, 18 to 12. 18 to 12 is 3 to 2, so it would be a plus 3. Plus 3. And then we'd also get a plus 2 for attacking a disrupted core, which is the flipped nature. So it'd be a plus 5. A plus 5 to our die roll. That's not too bad, and we could actually whack this guy and really hurt him if we rolled well. But I think it's too risky of a move. And you can kind of look at the combat charts and see that, you know, if you have 3 to 1 odds, which is sort of this rough military adage of you need 3 to 1 odds as the attacker to win, 3 to 1 odds would give you a plus 6, and that's much, much safer. Much, much safer of a play for your die roll. And if you can get plus 6, plus some disruption bonuses, maybe you're up to plus 8, then you're really in the neighborhood of being able to really hit an opponent. So I'm actually going to not do any land combats this turn. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, you've got surprise. Well, the surprise is only going to do us so good now. We're past the point of where it's really going to help us, except for maybe attacking across this river. We're going to lose that benefit later, but I think us being in mountain terrain will keep these guys from being able to do any attacks against us here. One of the things that we're going to look at on the next Central Power Impulse is that typically, if you really want to break open a line, you need to perform offensives, and those are detailed. What an offensive is and how it works is related to offensive points. All of that's covered in Section 18 of the rules. If we looked at our production chart, you can actually see some countries already have some offensive points. We will look to leverage them probably next impulse. You have to use the offensive points to be able to do the offensive. I believe at the beginning of the impulse, I think. And in this particular case, I have chosen not to do that. I want to get the rest of my units in place before I do this. Essentially what it's going to do is it's going to boost and multiply the combat factors of our attacking units, so we'll actually be able to get better combat odds than, 3 to 2. It'll maybe be more like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, maybe even 4 to 1, depending on how much power we can concentrate. So we're going to hold off on doing any real attacks this impulse. So next are going to be air rebases, and we get 2 of these for a land action, and we are going to want to make use of them. So we're going to rebase this balloon unit, and its range is 1. So it can only do, when you do an air rebase, you can actually move a unit twice its normal range. So if this normal range is the yellow number here, or the number in the yellow circle is 1, we can move the balloon 2 spaces. So I'm going to do 1 and 2. I'm going to put it right here so that it can help in observing these hexes for combat. I'm going to just put it at the bottom of the stack. I can then look at this unit and move it. I can actually move it pretty far. I don't think I want to move it very far, though, because underneath this stack is the city of Sarajevo, and it's got plenty of stacking limit for airplanes. I'm just going to move it up 1. And its range of 3 on the next impulse means it can come out pretty far and hit most of this front. And eventually we'll move it up as we need to keep pushing down if we can make it that far. So the rebases now are complete. And then the final step that we're going to concern ourselves with this video and this turn is reorganization, which is basically you can have an HQ unit, in which we have a couple on the board right now. Down here on this front we have Conrad, and then we have Friedrich over here. these HQ units can flip themselves to unflip other units, basically reorganize them because they're disrupted. So I could get this particular artillery flipped back up to be useful again for next impulse, but I don't think I want to do that. I want to leave Conrad set up because he's maybe going to be using offensive points, which requires that an HQ unit be face up. So no reorganization, and then the final action that we would take is we would roll to see if the action stage is going to be over. Now, if we look at this again, the roll value is NA, so we're not actually going to do a die roll to see if the turn ends. Okay, well, I think that is actually all I'm going to do for this video. The video is almost an hour long already, and will probably be an hour long by the time I finish this. The next set of actions that are going to take place is that it will become the allied side's turn, so we would move the impulse marker up. We'll flip it to denote it is the allied impulse. And it's going to start basically with Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary and only Austria-Hungary. It could then call out its reserves because it's now at war with a major power. And then it's going to do a very similar set of things, right? It's going to take a land action. It's going to do some ground strikes, which I don't think we're actually going to be able to do anywhere, it looks like. But they will also then do movement and prepare for combat and take some undefended areas. And all of that is going to, then get even more intense when the third impulse occurs and Germany starts the general start of the war by declaring war on all the other major powers that are relevant this early. And then all the other units come into play and things get a little more hairy. But for now, just the opening actions of the war, we've seen Austria-Hungary come in and take Belgrade, get some political points for that, put some stress on the Serbians, who've taken a very defensive posture, and we will see what else happens. Yeah, I think we're doing good. Okay, so if you've watched this so far, thank you for watching. I will look to do Impulse 2, the video for that, very, very soon. I want to make sure I get this one finished recording and uploaded and formatted and all that good stuff before I work on that. So probably won't be for a day or two for the next video. But with the holidays coming up, I should have some extra time away from work and other things to get more of these done. So, yeah, thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.